On Wednesday, April 28th, Representative Adam Byrd gave a presentation to the Pierce Township trustees and citizens about a piece of legislation he and Gene Schmidt have been working on that's on version 4 but secret from the citizens about dissolving villages and new rules and regulations around that process. The presentation was, I would say, a disaster. You can watch the whole thing, and I'm going to include a link in the comments of the whole hour-long presentation. In this video, I'm just going to focus on one thing he said and then my interaction with him, and then give a wrap-up and summary of my impression of the whole thing and what happens when you have politicians that have never really done honest work, have never really had a job outside government, coming up with this legislation that has absolutely nothing to do with making us more attractive or competitive as a state. It just has to do with preserving unneeded Byzantine layers of government. But let's get rolling.
You see our stakeholders that have been involved thus far at the state level. The county auditors have played a part in this, County Commissioners Association, the Ohio Attorney General's, the Ohio Auditor of State, the Municipal Electric Association, the Municipal League, and OTA have all played a role. And so that's something that we wanted to do from the very beginning.
Let's stop right here for a second. Look at the people that Adam Byrd consulted with about this glorious piece of legislation. What is missing from this list? How about constituents? Not a single constituent or constituent group was important enough to Adam Byrd to consult with until after he had this legislation, which at the time of this presentation is on version 4, according to Mr. Byrd himself. This shows you the mind not of a conservative, we the people oriented Republican, but of a big government liberal, a person who has spent their whole life on the government dole getting paid government paychecks. It is absolutely absurd that Adam Byrd never took any step whatsoever to ask any questions or consult with anybody from the constituent body or the business community. But let's keep going.
Under this draft, what it would take to get it on the ballot. And so 30% of registered electors would be required to place it on the ballot. That's a slight change from current language, which is 30% of those who voted in the last municipal election. So that's just a little bit higher, perhaps.
Now let's remember what he said in just that snippet about the very first bullet point on his very first chart that had any substance on it, and listen to my interaction with Representative Adam Byrd.
Live, Chris. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, guys. So, Adam, just a couple quick. I just have a few quick things, very pointed. Could you please share a copy of version 4 of this legislation with your constituents?
Yes, sir.
How can we get that? How can those? I'm not one of your constituents, but how can they get that actual draft?
Yes. Hopefully, we can get that email tomorrow.
Okay.
I would like to give that to those who have put in a public records request. I've turned the public records request over,
which I'm one of them,
to council, and so we should be able to get that to those who put in that public request. And besides that, we definitely want to get it to our electeds.
Okay, I get it. So let me just for sake of people's time. So the answer is yes. I think that this bill is fundamentally what you went through starting out, competitive, it's anti-rights of the citizens, it's a complete opposite of limited government mentality. But let me give you an example on your first point you made, which was about the 30% registered voters, because I actually have the live numbers for Bethel to use as a comparison.
Okay.
Bethel had 313 voters, which by the way, you described the 30% as a little change. Okay, Bethel has 1,695 registered voters. They had 313 vote in the last municipal election. Their under current statute, their dissolved number is 94 on a petition. So in your world, that number would need to be 508. So 508 people in Bethel would need to sign a petition, let me finish my comment.
Sure.
162% more than the number of people that voted in Bethel, and 550% more than the number of people that would be required to sign a petition today. So this is clearly just a bill masquerading to make it almost impossible to dissolve units of government in Ohio. Now, I'll let you respond to all that. I'll get all my stuff out and then I'll mute and you can respond as you think is appropriate. So we are one of the least competitive states in the United States. Okay. We rank typically 48th or less in terms of business competitive. And the number one reason is the unbelievable complex layers of government in Ohio, where a county like Claremont County has almost 200 elective positions, even after Amelia and Newtonsville have dissolved. So we have to really be thinking in Ohio about how are we going to be competitive, and isn't going to be by preserving little fiefdom governments, making it harder for them to get to trim down and get rid of government that's not really needed or effective anymore is not a Republican thing to be doing. Okay. So I take great umbrage at that. And I also take great umbrage at the 4-year thing, the 4-year pause. God forbid the citizens would lock down corrupt and bad government, which is something you fear, by filing these things. I don't think that anybody in Amelia that was involved that I knew in the effort to dissolve felt like citizens were just chomping at the bit to dissolve their village. It took a long road to get there. And it took not just a vote, but it took a charter change. And then it took getting something on the ballot. And by the way, Mr. Byrd, remember the numbers that we're talking about that I used for Bethel as an example of taking the number required from 94 to 508, which would be 162% of the people who voted in the last election. That isn't to dissolve the village. That's just to get it on the ballot and let people vote on it. So you're trying to basically block people from being able to even vote on these things by making it impossible to do so. Back real quick to the 4-year pause, and then I'll wrap up. I always love politicians that talk about limited government and their conservative principles, but they want a 4-year pause on being able to have a dissolution vote. But you say nothing about, for example, a 4-year pause on re-implementing income taxes over and over and over again, like in Bethel, that the council has done. They're repeatedly abusive to the citizens. I've never heard you or anybody else advocate that if a school district has a levy and it fails, they should have to wait 4 years to do it again. So I'd ask you maybe to brush up, maybe read a Ronald Reagan book or something like that. Read something that is about conservative economics and conservative governance. But these things that you're putting in this bill, it's clearly, and I know now why you didn't tell me some of these things when I asked you on April 15th, because this bill is clearly a bill designed to protect layers of government that are not necessary in Ohio anymore and are part of a root problem as to why we're so uncompetitive. Look at our county, Adam. The villages across the county that are some of the most destitute places in our county are the highest tax places because of their income taxes. That's not working. These village models have become fiefdoms. And by the way, let's not forget, just in case anybody would get confused, if a village gets to 5,000 people, it becomes a city and it legally cannot be dissolved. So these are places that have gone on for decades, sometimes millennia, without ever having attained a growth to get them to 5,000 people. It's highly inefficient in a modern society. It's a throwback to frontier stuff. It's like the township model is. And I would just ask you to basically, maybe the same thing will happen with this as on your don't test kids that have been out of school from COVID bill, and the whole thing will get reversed. If anything, it should be easier to dissolve unnecessary places. But the notion that you're going to make it pretty much damn near impossible for citizens to even vote on it says a lot about what your real political views are about limited government. So you can respond to any of that you want, but I appreciate, and Alan, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak.
I actually looked at the village of Bethel, the number of registered voters in Bethel as an example when I was working through that. And I maybe I made a mistake, but I certainly didn't find 1,600 registered voters in Bethel. And so again, if I am wrong on that.
How many did you find?
I thought I found 500.
Registered
okay, there's
voters?
There's only two precincts in Bethel.
Okay, well, precinct in Claremont County would be way more than, if there are two precincts, it's going to be way more than 500 voters.
Yeah,
As a precinct size. Where I got the number from Adam, and I'd love to make sure we have accurate numbers. I just did while we were talking. I went and totaled the voter database for Bethel,
Mhm.
So that's how, so you might also define what that means. So I just gave you a number that was as of, I think it was January 1 or so of this year, how many voters showed in the voter database for the village of Bethel when it was 1,695. Perhaps
Well,
that's not the basis for the calculation, but I bet you the numbers when you would do the calculations, it's going to be your 30% of registered voters is some astronomical percentage change. I don't think that's going to go from 550% of the current requirement down to, 110% of that requirement. It's a very significant change you're trying to push through under the guise of of even saying yourself it's some little minimal change.
Well, I said a minimal change because that's what it looked like to me. And perhaps I made a mistake in the number of village residents in Bethel when I ran that for myself. And so I'm definitely willing to go back and look at that. If the number of residents and the number of votes that you just elaborated on is true, then I agree with your point of view, and I agree that it would make it near impossible for that to ever make it onto the ballot. So I'm definitely willing to relook at that.
So just
and
as
I may
just
have
because
made
it
a
might be
mistake.
helpful, Adam, the number of, according to the census and the census data adjusted for 2019, the village of Bethel had 2783 population. So I think my number 1695 is probably a pretty good number on how many registered voters there might be in Bethel.
Well, see, I didn't go to census data. I went to the Board of Elections, and maybe that was a mistake of mine, but I went to the Board of Elections to see how many registered voters were in the two precincts of Bethel.
Well, I went to the voter database and actually totaled the numbers myself. So all I'm trying to
Okay.
point out is that if the entire population, according to the census, is 2783, it's probably within the ballpark that the number of registered voters in like a 15, 16, 1700 kind of count.
Okay. Well, here's what I will do, and I will commit to is I'll get a hold of the Board of Elections and see if they can help me with the exact number of registered voters in multiple villages here in Claremont County and compare that to the number that voted in the last municipal election and do the math and see if that is significant. And when I had done this previously, the math, I may have made a mistake, but I didn't see it as a significant thing, and perhaps I had the wrong number. So I will commit to taking a relook at that, and I may be wrong. And again, this is why we have meetings like this so that we can get feedback. And I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Chris,
And what
can I-
about the 4-year pause thing? And why don't we then have a 4-year pause if we're going to do that on income taxes being put back in place or school levies being able to be put back on the ballot? If we're going to keep citizens from being able to hold their government accountable, why don't we have government be held accountable for not constantly trying to get citizens paying more taxes through ballot initiatives and income taxes?
That's a fair philosophical question, and I would say that from my perspective, I don't think it's from your perspective. Your first choice is to reelect a mayor and reelect a council that are going to lead your village in a way that you see fit. And I don't think striking down your village is the first option, and I think that you and I are probably going to disagree on that. But the moment you sign, get that petition turned in, it locks down the village's ability to do business, and that could be constantly done and lock down a village all the time.
But just to clarify here, I don't think anybody thinks the first option when you got a grievance in your village is to dissolve your village. And I think it's completely insensitive to what's gone on in some of the villages in Claremont County for you to act like there was some knee jerk to dissolve your village. It just shows that there's a fundamental bias you have towards preservation of government. And I'm convinced all politicians, whether you're Republicans or Democrats, taxing more, never rolling anything back, never limiting the size and scope of government. I heard somebody say everybody on this call that does not work in government has been through things like downsizings, restructurings, less personnel needed because of modernization and technology, except for government. Government is the only entity in the United States that continually just grows, just taxes more. None of these things cause it to become any more efficient. And instead of looking at this like a fiefdom or that community is based on some government thing, that maybe you had to look at it, what would make Ohio more competitive? And the problem with Ohio right now is all these layers of government we have, all these little villages, all these little tax things makes it extremely hard to do business in Ohio. It's why we're losing congressional seats, why we're growing at a much lower rate than other states, because people don't want to come here. So I would just encourage you to start thinking about how you like go to, for example, the Buckeye Institute. Have you talked to the Buckeye Institute? They've done research papers on the inefficiency of Ohio because of village government. Have you engaged them at all? That's a conservative think tank in Columbus.
No, but I'm willing to.
Okay. Well, I'd encourage you to actually, get on the path of how can we make Ohio more competitive. I know it may be politically challenging because you got a bunch of, frankly, a lot of times yahoo mayors and council members that want to just preserve their little fiefdoms. But if we don't address competitiveness in Ohio, and if we don't have state reps that are going to address competitiveness in Ohio, it's going to be a bleak future for our kids. The reality is our kids aren't going to live in Ohio. They're going to go to other places because we never figured out, people of your and my generation, never figured out and had the realization that it's not about some fiefdom village. It's about having an economy and a county and a state where it's a good place for people to live. And that's not because of little fiefdom governments.
Okay, well, Chris. If I could just respond real quickly to that. And the economy of Claremont County is doing very well. And the Claremont County Chamber of Commerce's economic forecast report shows that it's expected to grow. And certainly it's an important priority of myself and my Republican colleagues in Columbus that we be a business-friendly state and that we be welcoming to business. So,
well, just as a last point, because I know people are going to give me the hook, is that remember there was a time when Butler County and Claremont County were basically the same size. Claremont County today is 20 to 30 years behind Butler County in economic development. So before we all clap and tell how great we're doing, we might want to look at how our region has evolved and how our growth has been stunted compared to Butler County and to a lesser degree, but similar, Warren County.
Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Alan. So I went back to the Board of Elections to confirm the numbers that I used, and I got to tell you, I'm sorry, I was off by 5. It is currently 1690 registered voters in Bethel, not 1695, which is the number I calculated on the fly. So let's do the quick rundown with those numbers. The old way in the dissolution would require 94 signatures on a petition to put it on a ballot based on, in the Bethel example, 313 people have voted in their last municipal election. In the Adam Byrd way, it would require 507 signatures on a petition just to get it on the ballot, which is 162% of the people who actually vote in Bethel, and is 539% of the current approach's requirements. This is not a conservative. This is not a limited government, we the people type person. This is a person in Adam Byrd who doesn't want citizens to even have the ability to vote on things, to make it impossible to vote on things. It's completely wrong. It is complete trash. And the whole presentation, if you go listen to the hour, goes downhill from there. And since then, the Amelia folk that were on the call that you can watch when you watch the whole thing, they've been going off. Everybody's been going off on how stupid this stuff is and how this guy that's presenting, how clueless he is on the current law and all kind of other things. He doesn't know what a charter village really is. He doesn't understand the concept of home rule. And you might not either, but you're not the guy writing the laws. And these are very important things that play into that. So let's think again before we move on about what this guy is doing and what his competence is. Because I say, but wait, where is a version 4 copy of the legislation? You heard him promise it to me. He has not delivered it. Why? Why? Mr. Transparent. If you go watch the whole thing, he starts out by saying how transparent he wants to be as he talks about version 4 of a set of legislation that we're not allowed to see, and he still hasn't provided a copy. This is just a track record, frankly, between him and Gene Schmidt of stupid, dumb legislation. And we got to pay attention to this. We have got to pay attention to this. Remember, Adam Byrd's first piece of legislation, I think, was to not have any testing of students in public school during this time period in which they've had to do disastrous remote learning. What do you call that? Protecting teachers' unions from accountability or even the optics of how terrible it has been. Fortunately, his bill got totally reversed by the Republican caucus, and now it requires testing. Hey, but he still takes credit for a bill that's totally the opposite of what he proposed. Of course, he's got, as you saw in the Enquirer, you saw posted here, his very important bill about having a University of Alabama license plate to honor his father in Ohio. This is something critical. Hey, maybe if you're close to the Zimmer power plant, maybe as you're losing your job because your state representative does shit for you, maybe you have a chance to get maybe a discount on a University of Alabama license plate that Representative Byrd is all in on. And then we got Gene Schmidt. She's working on eliminating the death penalty that is already on a moratorium basically forever in the state of Ohio, because that's absolutely critical to Claremont County that we get something that's not happening to not happen more. Where do these people come up with these ideas? Do they ever really think about the citizens? We end up, as a result of this, living in a state that is not competitive, with spineless representatives who do dumb shit like a University of Alabama license plate, but don't do anything to check our crazy governor, Mike DeWine. And we just get constant legislation that does nothing but make us even less competitive, less attractive for business, and less attractive for people to move to. It's why we're losing a congressional seat. It's why we're declining relative to the rest of the country. It's why you can't find good jobs. It's why you can't have reps talk about any real solutions. On and on and on. And these people play us. They're conservative Republicans leading up to Election Day. But I tell you what, a guy who figures out how to protect and preserve big government and add to big government and hold council members in place that have been voted out, that is not a conservative. And these guys, maybe Adam and Gene, when they're talking about this legislation, should ask themselves, hey, what a crazy idea. Why don't we do something that the constituents actually care about or actually makes us more competitive, more attractive, lower taxes, all the crap we talk about when we're running for office. Final thing, I want to give a shout out. When these guys were running for office and Joe Dills was running against them, Joe Dills is the only person in one of the secret Claremont County Republican meetings that I'm always bitching about, that when the topic came up of dissolving villages, he's the only one that said that he was for reducing the size of government, the amount of government in Ohio. Adam Byrd and Gene Schmidt dodged/wouldn't answer that question. Why? Because they are beholden, as you saw from Adam Byrd's thing, to all these state things, all these places you never heard of and don't talk with you, and they're beholden to fiefdoms and little political rigged operations, the swamp operations. They're not worrying about any real reform that's going to get you better jobs, that it's going to get you more opportunity, that's going to get you taxed less. So there you have it. Hopefully this whole bill will get redone, get pulled, get straightened out, and hopefully you'll go listen to the whole hour presentation so you can hear the different Amelia folk talk about this legislation, as well as Adam Byrd basically comes up snake eyes on trying to sell people on absolutely a terrible piece of legislation as it stands right now.